Excellent. So we are, as usual, a very small group today. And, iridology is just like that, right? Iridology is one of those very niche things. If I was promoting a webinar on weight loss, we'd have 1,000 people here, right? If I was promoting a webinar on better sleep, we'd have 1,000 people here. Or on dealing with arthritis or blood pressure or things like that, it would be huge. But when we're looking at iridology, it is a very tiny niche market. I mean, first off, it usually narrows down to practitioners, and then it's that subset of practitioners who are interested in iridology. So very, very tiny niche, and so we always have a small group. It'll be lovely if more join us, but if not, we roll with what we've got. Okay, then. So here we are today talking about iridology myths and fables. Myths and fables. And we're doing this because there are a lot of myths and fables out there when it comes around to iridology, right? There's a lot of half-truths, things that have been disproved, and we want to make sure that we are not perpetuating those myths, that we are not misleading our clients with bad information. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this one because I talk about this one a lot because it drives me crazy, and that is the owl story. And the reason it drives me crazy is because no one seems to know what the truth is behind this, as far as what the original story even was. Ignaz von Petzschle was a young boy in Europe. He caught an owl. I've also heard that it was a hawk, and don't know if the owl had a broken wing or a broken leg when he was found, or if he got hurt in the catching. And then it talks about how this 11-year-old boy was astute enough to notice that the owl's eye had something different in it, and he watched that thing go away. Well, we just don't know how true that is. Bill Cardona, who is one of the original founders of what is now the International Iridology Practitioners Association, he is also a registered pharmacist and a naturopathic doctor, said this: modern iridology can't explain the owl's story. Von Petzschle's story from a very long time ago has not been reproduced. So it's a waste of time to repeat it. It just creates confusion. Critical thinking is required when applied to any topic. I found that very interesting. He goes on to say that if you look at a picture of an owl's eye or almost any animal, the structure of the iris is different from humans. There is no anterior stroma in an animal's eye, just a smooth posterior leaf without individual strands of fiber. So it is structurally impossible to have the thing happen that Ignaz von Petzschle reported. So one of the myths that really is propagated, particularly in social media, and this is a holdover from the 1950s, 1960s, when iridology research had stopped, when the Cold War was on. There was no communication really between Germany and Russia and Canada, and North America. And so all of the ongoing research that was happening there didn't come over here. And so the information that was perpetuated here was old. It was not valid anymore. So oftentimes you will see on Facebook, for instance, or on just about all social media, people will post their pictures, their before and after photos. And they will be using photographic images to monitor for changes in the body. So here's some things that we need to remember about this. The first is that, if you do a photo now and you do a photo 2 months from now and you're expecting to see changes, it's not going to happen. As a general rule, yes, the eyes do change, but things do not dissipate. They don't go away. They accumulate in the iris. So when we look at photos like the ones you see on your screen now, these are my husband's eyes. The image on the left was taken when he was 42, and the image on the right was taken when he was 65. There will be people there who will go, oh, his eyes are so much bluer now. He's done a lot of cleansing work. Well, no. The dead giveaway here is that we use different equipment. And the different equipment is going to create a different image. And you cannot use photographic images for comparison of color. All right. What I really want you to notice, however, is that in those 20 odd years, there is a significant difference between these eyes. And that significant difference, which we don't even need to say, well, what about the variation in color? Because this is something that's definitely different. When we look and we see this pigment here, it was clearly not here 23 years previously, right? So this is actually a scan of a print done with a Canon Rebel print camera from back in the day. This is a digital photo. So when we look at this, we are recognizing, again, a couple of things. Number one, pigment accumulated over time. That's the first thing. The second thing we recognize is that the photography uses different technology. And that different technology alone accounts for the color variation. And so it's really important that we not use photos because there are too many variables when we are tracking changes, because we're not going to track the dispersion. We don't use the eyes to say, oh my goodness, you're getting healthier, or that's getting better, because the eyes are inherently predisposed. They have genetic information that goes back 3 to 4 generations. Some of what we see in the eyes is what the person owns, and some of it is what they've inherited from previous generations. What you can notice, and you can notice it very clearly in these images, is that the sclera has changed. So look really, really closely at this, how this blood vessel at the age of 42 is much thinner. So the sclera is very dynamic. Something has resolved over those 23 years. It's getting less significant. But when we look at this jag here, it looks like a lightning bolt almost. Notice how over the years it has gotten heavier. So something else is brewing, is setting up. So if we're looking for dynamic changes of things coming up and things receding, the sclera is what we want to be looking at, not the iris, not the iris at all. You know, the other thing is that black lines, healing lines, just that show trauma don't happen, and neither do healing lines. This is a study of my own eyes. And again, we've got the same camera, but with different light settings going on. You see the difference here? This has to do with whether you've got your digital camera set for tungsten or for fluorescent lighting or for daylight lighting. It will change the color of the image. So you need to know when you're doing iris photos, you need to know what your f-stop is, you need to know your shutter speed, you need to know your ISO, and you need to know you've got the setting, what your flash is set for. Beyond that, you also need to know if your batteries are still strong, because even something as simple as weak batteries will alter the exposure of the image. All right, so this is an image of my eye from 2017. And this is the area we are looking at right here. It has always been like this. It has never been any different than this. March 17th, 2019, I had slipped on the ice in one of our fabulous Alberta springs with the melting and the freezing that happens. Slipped on the ice, broke both of my bones in my arm near the wrist, required surgery that put in a metal plate and screws for each broken bone. So I now have a couple of metal plates and 12 screws in my arm. But you can see in here, there is no black line for the trauma, right? And then on Mother's Day, I can laugh about it now. Back then I wasn't. On Mother's Day, so I was just out of my cast for about a week. On Mother's Day, I fell down some stairs and I landed on my elbow and I broke the olecranon off in the same arm that I had just healed the wrist of. Ended up in surgery again, and they installed wires and pins and things to hold the olecranon onto the arm bone so that it would actually heal. And that happened on May the 12th. And you'll notice there are no trauma lines in here, none whatsoever. We don't have that black line that, like what Ignaz von Petschle said about the owl. Here we are, August, and I've got that little pop-up that keeps getting in the way, August 5th, and what we can see is, again, slightly different settings in the camera, but there's no black line there. There are none of those fill-in healing lines that we're always taught about, and yet I now have lots of hardware in my arm and had significant trauma in my arm. But I'm here to tell you the arm is well healed, which is really good news. Really good news. And I thank not only the fact that I've been blessed with a great knowledge of holistic healing, but that I also have a brilliant physiotherapist. I don't think I would have the range of motion or the strength that I've got if I did not have the physiotherapist I have. So when we look at this again, looking again at my husband's eyes and looking at the concept of could we heal, could we cleanse out these toxins? Because that's one of the myths that is out there, that these pigments in here are all toxins. I think in the North American vernacular, they would probably call this sulfur accumulation in the body. And the question is, can you actually get rid of this by doing cleansing? And the answer is, no, you can't. No, you can't. What you need to be aware of is a couple of things. Number one is that pigment will look more dense if the pupil is large, right? Because you're taking that pupil tissue and squeezing it into a narrower area, and that will make it more dense. This is kind of like the problem Lululemon had with their yoga pants a few years ago, right? On the hanger, they looked great, but as soon as you put them on and they stretched out, they became transparent, right? So things dispersed. And that's not that they actually disperse and go away here, but they spread out. So when the pupil is smaller, we've got this iris tissue is spread out, and it will then, it kind of stretches out that pigment, right? Because the tissue where the pigment is sitting gets stretched out, and that makes the pigment look less dense. And many people will call that cleansing, and it's not cleansing and it's not healing. It actually has to do with the physics of what happens to the pigment when it's compressed or when it's stretched out. So there's no evidence, none whatsoever, that says that we can actually cleanse toxins out. Harry Wolff, who was the other co-founder of what is now the International Iridology Practitioners Association, and he is responsible for bringing European constitutional iridology to North America, said this about the pigment. He said, in fact, it's bogus and a dogma only found among some holdouts from the Lindlar, Kreitzer, and Jensen schools of thought. The notion that certain metals, minerals, toxins routinely show up as diagnostic indicators in the iris has long been refuted and proven unreliable. There is no evidence to support the notion that heavy metal toxicity is measurable in the iris, likewise drugs, candida, etc. What we do know is when we have pigment that develops or appears over time, this is again, an inherent predisposition. So I want you to think for a moment about things like age spots that show up in hands and faces, or hair going gray. We understand the physiology that causes things like that, but there is also almost always a gene that is triggering that just gets tripped, turned on at a certain time, and that begins to start the process. So it's very much a situation of this was inherently predisposed, and this is telling us about things in the body that, again, are inherently predisposed to begin triggering now, or when these pigments surface, when they show up in the eye. That gives us information to work with. Back here, when my husband was 42, I wouldn't have thought, I need to do a ton of liver support with him. Our diet was clean, and he was active, and he was healthy, and he is still active and healthy, and our diet is even more clean now. But now I know that we also, and over the last few years, we've begun supporting his liver even more because he is genetically predisposed to have some glitchy things with his liver. And isn't it marvelous that we see this in the eyes? It's not like, oh my goodness, you're so toxic. It's like, oh, that's great information for us to be working with. The other thing, another one of these that drives me nuts is the idea that you can see parasites in the eyes, that you can see the presence of parasites in the body by looking at the eyes, that all of these lines that radiate outwards are indications of parasites. I hope not. Harry Wolff again says, American sources from the turn of the 20th century are very unreliable, repetitive, and very misleading, with silly and debunked notions like drug spots, psoriatic itch spots, healing lines, parasite lines, and brown eyes turn blue with detox. Now, I was so relieved when I started learning constitutional iridology because I'd been an iridologist for 10 years already. And I was getting really, really, really frustrated because I was putting clients through cleanses. Their eyes weren't changing color. I would put them, I'd tell them they had parasites, and we'd put them on a parasite cleanse, and none of their symptoms would change. Just everything that I learned about iridology was not happening the way I was told it would happen. And then I received word that someone whom I greatly respected, whose name I will not mention and have not mentioned in this presentation so far, had published an iridology textbook and was up against some publishing deadlines. And so what she had done, particularly with the lighter colored eyes, is that had different things happening in them, was she used color filters in her photography to mask things, to make it look like they'd done a cleanse and they'd gotten rid of certain pigment. So how do you know, how can you tell if what you're comparing are photos that were done with the same camera on the same settings with the same lighting? You always want to look at the sclera color and the skin tones. Because if the sclera color and the skin tones are way different, there's been some photographic monkeying around going on. We don't see parasites in the brain. And here's the deal, right? Only licensed medical practitioners are legally allowed to diagnose or prescribe. And so even as iridologists, if you're an ND or an MD, we don't diagnose from the eyes. We just don't. I did study, as I said, Jensenian iridology at the outset for the first 10 years of my career as an iridologist. And I did a lot of diagnosing from the eyes back then. You're telling people what was wrong with them. And the funny thing, the sad thing was I was almost always wrong. I would say, this marking says you have, and they'd go, no, I don't. Well, this marking says blah, blah, blah. No, not me, right? And it was really, really frustrating. So when I heard about constitutional iridology in the early 1990s, that sounds like so long ago. Shh, don't tell me it really is. I found out, I began to discover with doing constitutional that I was right a lot more than I was wrong. Because constitutional lets us ask questions. We don't tell the client anything. We ask questions. And I find that when I couple what I see in the eyes with what I know about the client, I am right so much more of the time. And really what I'm right about is understanding why the client has the symptoms they have and understanding the pathway I need to take in order to help them get their health back on track. Is that going to change their eyes? Not going to change their iris one little bit. Bill Caradonna has said this: iridology should not be used to diagnose. It is a unique assessment tool to gain understanding of the blueprint of the body, including tendencies towards illness patterns or assessment of resiliency and resistance against negative influences. But diagnosing the presence or status of an illness or disease is never appropriate. So I've been using iridology as a tool in my practice, constitutional iridology as a tool in my practice for about 30 years now. And I've loved and have taken great joy in actually teaching this art and the science to many practitioners and people who weren't practitioners, who were just interested in understanding this. So as we look at this concept, it's important to remember that this is a tool that helps to pull together everything you already know. So if you're a herbalist or a nutrition coach or an aromatherapist or a homeopath, the iridology will significantly, when you do it right, when you do constitutional iridology, it will help you in so many ways to create more effective programs for your clients, to understand your clients on a much, much deeper level. Thank you so much for being with me today. I so appreciate it. We'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.